Why does a case that is now really more than 36 years old matter?
Because somebody died, and no matter what, ultimately that's our job, to find the truth.
When you talk to us, everything fit. Makes more sense of what happened and is corroborated by other people.
There's a police report sitting in a file somewhere in Los Angeles. It has one man's own words in it. Christopher Walken was on that boat. He was there the night Natalie would vanish into the dark water off Catalina Island. For 40 years, he said almost nothing in public, but he did talk once, to police, quietly, and buried in that report is a version of that night most people have never actually heard. Picture a boat rocking gently in the dark, and somewhere on it, a woman who was about to disappear forever. That was the scene on the night of November 28, 1981. Natalie Wood was 43 years old. She had already lived 3 lifetimes of fame. She was a child star in the 1940s, a teenage sensation in Rebel Without a Cause, an Oscar-nominated actress by the time most people finished college. By 1981, she was married to actor Robert Wagner, and together they were one of the most famous couples in Hollywood. That Thanksgiving weekend, the couple took their yacht, called the Splendour, out to Catalina Island. They brought along a guest. His name was Christopher Walken. He was Natalie's co-star in an upcoming film called Brainstorm, and at the time, he was still a rising actor, not yet the legend people know today. Also on board was the boat's captain, a man named Dennis Davern. 4 people, 1 boat, a quiet weekend getaway that should have ended with everyone going home. On the night of November 28th, the group had dinner at a restaurant on Catalina Island. Witnesses later said Natalie and Robert had been drinking heavily. They returned to the boat. And somewhere between that dinner and the early hours of the next morning, something happened. Something that would end with Natalie Wood in the water, and a mystery that has never fully been solved. Nobody outside that boat knows exactly what was said between those 4 people that night. But 3 of them were still alive to answer questions afterward. One of them was Christopher Walken. And for decades, almost nobody paid attention to what he actually told investigators. That statement exists. It was written down. It has details in it that never made the evening news, never made it into the tabloid headlines, and barely made it into the public conversation at all. Before we get to what Walken said, we need to understand what was happening on that boat in the hours before Natalie Wood vanished, because the argument that started that night would end up shaping the rest of the story. Here is something strange about this case. Only 4 people were on that boat, and only 3 of them lived to tell anyone what happened. That alone is why this story has haunted people for over 40 years. There were no other witnesses, no security cameras, no phone footage, just the open sea, a rocking boat, and 4 people whose stories would later not quite match up. Robert Wagner was Natalie's husband. They had actually been married once before, divorced, and then remarried years later. Their relationship was famous for being passionate, on again, off again, and, according to people close to them, occasionally explosive. Christopher Walken was there because he was working with Natalie on Brainstorm. At the time, he was in his late 30s, quietly building a career that would later make him one of the most recognizable actors in the world. But in 1981, he was still just a guest on someone else's boat. And then there was Dennis Davern, the captain. He knew the couple well. He had worked for them before. He would later become one of the most important voices in this entire mystery, because he was the one who eventually broke the silence, years later, and made public claims about what really happened that night. But here's the thing. In 1981, right after Natalie's death, nobody talked. Not really. The investigation happened quietly. The case was closed fast. Her death was ruled an accidental drowning, and for years, that was simply the story everyone accepted. Robert Wagner gave interviews here and there. He wrote a memoir decades later. Christopher Walken said almost nothing publicly for 40 years. He would occasionally get asked about it in interviews, and he would give short, careful answers or simply decline to talk about it at all. That silence became part of the mystery itself. People started to wonder, what does Walken know? Why doesn't he talk? Is he protecting someone? Or is there simply nothing more to say? The truth is more complicated than either of those guesses, because Walken did talk, just not to the public. He talked to the police in the days right after Natalie's death, while the memory of that night was still fresh. That statement was recorded. It sat quietly in an investigative file for years. And when it eventually surfaced, it gave us the closest thing we have to Christopher Walken's own account of what happened aboard the Splendour. So what does that report actually say? What did Walken remember about the fight, the drinking, and the moment everything went wrong? That's where this story gets its most important details. And it starts with an argument that nobody on that boat wanted to happen. Every mystery has a moment where things start to go wrong. For Natalie Wood, that moment happened over a glass of wine. According to accounts that later became public, the night started out relaxed. The four of them were on the boat, drinking, talking, and by most descriptions, having a normal evening. But something shifted. An argument broke out between Natalie and Robert. The captain, Dennis Davern, would later describe that argument in stark detail, years after the fact. He claimed that Robert Wagner became angry, that a wine bottle was smashed during the fight, and that the tension on the boat became something far heavier than a simple disagreement between a married couple. What caused the argument? This is where accounts have varied over the years. Some versions point to jealousy. Natalie and Christopher Walken have been working closely together on Brainstorm, spending long hours filming and rehearsing. Some people close to the situation suggested Robert felt uneasy about how close his wife and her co-star had become, at least professionally. Christopher Walken, for his part, gave his own account of that night to investigators. He described a group drinking together and having what started as an intense but ordinary conversation, largely about Natalie's demanding work schedule. He said he briefly joined in before stepping outside to get some fresh air, wanting to remove himself from the tension building at the table. When he came back inside, he said the mood had shifted. People were apologizing to each other. Natalie went to her cabin for the night. Walken, feeling the night had already gone long enough, went to his own room to sleep. This detail matters more than it might seem, because it tells us that by the time Walken went to bed, everything seemed in his eyes resolved. An argument had happened. People had cooled down. Natalie was safely in her cabin. As far as he knew, the night was simply over. But it wasn't over. Somewhere between that quiet ending and the following morning, Natalie would left the boat, or was put into the water, or fell. The details of exactly how and why remain one of the most argued over parts of this entire case. What we do know is that Walken's version of the argument is calm, almost understated, especially compared to Dennis Davern's much more dramatic description of a smashed bottle and a heated blow-up. Two men, same boat, same night, very different memories of how intense things actually got. That gap between accounts is part why this case has never fully closed. And it's about to get even more complicated, because what Christopher Walken told police next includes details that very few people have ever actually read in full. Somewhere in a Los Angeles investigative file sits a document that very few people have ever read closely. It's Christopher Walken's own statement, given to police in the days after Natalie Wood's death. Not a talk show interview, not a carefully worded press release. A statement, given while the memory of that weekend was still raw. For decades, that report stayed mostly out of public view. It wasn't the kind of thing that made headlines in 1981. Investigations back then didn't get the same media spotlight that a case like this would get today. It sat quietly in a file, referenced occasionally by journalists digging into the case, but never widely discussed. When parts of it eventually became public, they gave the world its clearest look yet at Walken's actual memory of that night. In his own words, close to when it happened. According to that report, Walken described the night much the way we laid out in the last section: drinking, an intense conversation about Natalie's work schedule, him stepping outside briefly, coming back to find the mood softened, apologies exchanged, and Natalie heading to bed. Here's where it gets more specific. Walken told investigators that not long after that, the group realized both Natalie and the boat's small rubber dinghy were missing. His assumption, and apparently the group's assumption at the time, was that Natalie had taken the dinghy to shore, the way she reportedly had done on a previous night when the water got rough. Think about that for a second. Nobody panicked immediately. Nobody assumed the worst. They believed she had simply gone ashore, maybe frustrated, maybe just needing space after the argument. So they did what people do when they think everything is fine. They went to sleep. Walken said he went to his stateroom and went to bed, believing that explanation. It wasn't until morning that things changed. He described waking up to find that authorities had already been alerted and a search was underway. He recalled Robert Wagner appearing deeply worried, telling him that Natalie may have drowned. Then came the moment that seems to sit heaviest in his account. While listening to the radio, Walken heard that a body had been found in the water. He told investigators he was afraid to tell Wagner. Just imagine sitting there, holding information that could shatter someone's world, and not knowing how to say it out loud. A short time later, according to the report, someone else delivered the news to Wagner directly. This is a version of that night that came from Christopher Walken himself, recorded close to when it happened. It is calm, it is detailed in places, and it raises a question that has followed this case for over 40 years. If everyone believed Natalie had simply gone ashore, how did she end up in the water instead? And why do the pieces of that night still not fully add up? The next morning, the search that had started quietly overnight turned into something much bigger. Boats were out on the water. People were scanning the coastline. And then, the news that everyone had been dreading arrived. Natalie Wood's body was found floating about a mile from where the Splendour was anchored. Nearby, drifting separately, was a small rubber dinghy that had gone missing the night before. Here is a detail that makes this story even harder to shake. Natalie Wood had a well-known, lifelong fear of dark water. Those close to her said her mother had told her as a child that she would one day die in dark water, a warning rooted in old family superstition. For most of her adult life, friends said she avoided deep water whenever she could, and rarely, if ever, went swimming at night. And yet, this is exactly how she was found, in the dark water, alone. When investigators looked at the dinghy, something didn't sit right. The oars were still tied down. The key was switched to the off position. If Natalie had been trying to use that dinghy to reach shore or to get away from the boat, it would have made sense for the oars to be untied, ready to use. Instead, everything about the dinghy suggested it had never actually been operated that night. She was also found wearing a coat over her nightgown, not clothing suited for planning any kind of boat trip. The original investigation in 1981 ruled her death an accidental drowning. Case closed, at least officially, for nearly 3 decades. But questions never really went away. Why would a woman terrified of dark water end up in it? Why was the dinghy untouched in a way that didn't support the idea that she had tried to leave the boat on her own? And what really happened in that gap of time between her going to her cabin and her body being found in the water the next day? Investigators years later would also revisit findings about bruising on her body, details that had not been given much weight in the original 1981 investigation. This new attention to old evidence would eventually become the reason the case was reopened entirely, decades after everyone assumed the story was finished. For years, the public accepted the simple explanation. Tragic accident. A woman who had too much to drink wandered onto a small boat in the dark and fell. But somewhere out there, a boat captain was carrying a very different version of that night in his memory. And when he finally decided to speak, decades later, it would change how the entire world looked at this case. For nearly 30 years, the story stayed the same. Tragic accident. Case closed. The world moved on, and Natalie Wood became one more Hollywood legend whose death faded into old headlines. Then, in 2011, everything changed. Dennis Davern, the captain of the Splendour, broke his silence. In interviews, he claimed that what he witnessed that night was far more serious than a simple accident. He described the argument between Natalie and Robert as violent, said a wine bottle had been smashed in anger, and suggested the tension on that boat had escalated far beyond what the public had ever been told. Davern's decision to speak up wasn't just talk for cameras. Natalie's sister, Lana Wood, publicly asked authorities to reopen the investigation. Law enforcement listened. In 2011, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department officially reopened the case, citing new information that they said was substantial enough to justify another look. At a press conference announcing the reopening, one detail stood out. Investigators were asked directly whether Robert Wagner was considered a suspect. The answer at that time was no. Still, the reinvestigation dug deeper than the original one ever had. The coroner reviewed the case again and made a striking change. Natalie Wood's official cause of death was updated from simple accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. That phrase, undetermined factors, meant investigators could no longer rule out the possibility that something other than a pure accident had taken place. Years later, in 2018, Robert Wagner will be named a person of interest in the case, a label that fell short of naming him a suspect, but one that showed just how seriously investigators were now treating the unanswered pieces of that night. Through all of this renewed attention, Christopher Walken remained mostly quiet in public. He gave a few brief comments over the years when asked directly, but he never gave a dramatic new interview laying everything out. His most detailed account of that night still remains the one he gave to police back in 1981, close to the moment it happened. That contrast says something important. While the public conversation grew louder, filled with new claims, television specials, and headline after headline, the one written record closest to the actual night stayed exactly the same. Quiet, measured, almost fading into the background compared to everything that came after it. So where does that leave us? Decades of investigation, a reopened case, a change in official cause of death, and yet, still no final answer. What do we actually know for certain, and what remains nothing more than theory? That's the question we have to face honestly before this story can reach any kind of resolution. Here's the hard truth about this story. After more than 40 years, 3 official investigations, a reopened case, and a changed cause of death, there is still no final answer to what really happened to Natalie Wood. Let's separate what we actually know from what remains speculation. We know 4 people were on that boat. We know there was an argument that night, though accounts differ sharply on how intense it really was. Christopher Walken described it as tense, but resolved by the time everyone went to bed. Dennis Davern, years later, described something far more volatile, with a smashed bottle and raised voices. We know Natalie Wood and the boat's dinghy went missing sometime after she retired to her cabin. We know the group assumed she had gone ashore, the way she reportedly had the night before. We know Walken went to bed believing that explanation, only to wake up to a search already underway. We know her body was found the next morning, a mile from the boat, alongside an untouched dinghy with its oars still tied down. We know she had a lifelong, well-documented fear of dark water, the exact thing that ultimately took her life. What we don't know, and may never know for certain, is what actually happened in the hours between Natalie going to her cabin and her body being found in the water. We don't know if she went outside on her own, if she was trying to secure the noisy dinghy that had been banging against the boat, as one theory suggests, or if something else entirely took place. Christopher Walken's police statement remains one of the few pieces of this story recorded close to the actual night, not shaped by decades of retelling, media attention, or public pressure. It is careful, it is consistent, and it does not claim to know more than what he personally witnessed, which by his own account, ended the moment he went to sleep. That is perhaps the most honest part of this entire mystery. Sometimes the most important witness simply doesn't have the answer either. Natalie Wood's death remains officially unresolved, a case marked by undetermined factors rather than a clean explanation. Robert Wagner has never been named a suspect. Christopher Walken has never claimed to know what happened after he went to bed. And Dennis Davern's accounts, while dramatic, have never been enough on their own to prove a different version of events beyond doubt. Maybe that's the real lesson buried in this story. Not every mystery gets solved just because enough people ask questions about it for 40 years. Some truths stay locked in the dark water, along with the people who were there. Do you think Christopher Walken's account tells the whole story? Or do you think there's still a piece of that night the world has never heard? Let me know in the comments below. Every story like this has more than one witness, and more than one memory of the truth. Robert Wagner had his own version of that night, one he held on to for decades before finally putting it into words. In 2008, years after the original investigation closed, Robert Wagner released a memoir. In it, he spoke about the night his wife died, though even then, many readers felt he left out more than he shared. He described the argument as a normal disagreement between a married couple, nothing more serious than what any long relationship goes through. He denied any physical violence took place. He denied the version of events where a bottle was smashed in anger. According to Wagner's own account, he woke up at some point that night, noticed Natalie and the dinghy were missing, and assumed, like Walken did, that she had gone ashore on her own. He said he searched the boat, grew concerned, and eventually called for help once it became clear something was wrong. Here's where things get complicated again. Dennis Davern's account, the one he gave publicly starting in 2011, painted a very different picture. Davern claimed Wagner waited far longer than he should have before calling for help, and that his behavior that night did not match someone simply confused about where his wife had gone. Investigators looked closely at this exact detail during the reopened case. The timeline between when Natalie went missing and when the alarm was actually raised became one of the most scrutinized parts of the entire investigation. Robert Wagner has always denied any wrongdoing. He has never been charged with any crime. Even when he was named a person of interest in 2018, authorities were careful to clarify that this label did not mean he was suspected of causing her death. It simply meant investigators believed he had more information that could help close remaining gaps. Still, the public reaction to Wagner's memoir was mixed. Some believe his calm explanation. Others felt certain details were missing, smoothed over, or left deliberately vague. This is a strange thing about grief mixed with unanswered questions. The person closest to a tragedy is often the one people trust the least, simply because they were the one standing closest to it. So now we have three accounts. Christopher Walken's calm, early police statement, Dennis Davern's dramatic, delayed public claims, and Robert Wagner's careful, decades later memoir. 3 men, 1 boat, 3 different shades of the same story. And that gap between their accounts is exactly why theories about what really happened to Natalie would have never gone away. Whenever official answers run out, people start filling in the blanks themselves. And over more than 40 years, this case has produced no shortage of theories, some grounded in evidence, others built almost entirely on speculation. The first theory is the simplest, and it's also the one investigators originally settled on back in 1981. Natalie Wood, after drinking that night, went outside to deal with the dinghy, which was reportedly banging loudly against the side of the boat and disturbing her sleep. In trying to either secure it or climb into it, she slipped, fell into dark water, and could not save herself. No violence, no secrets, just a tragic, ordinary accident made worse by rough conditions and poor visibility. This theory lines up with something important. Natalie herself had complained in the past about the dinghy's noise keeping her awake at night. It's a detail that makes the accident theory feel very plausible, almost mundane in how simple it is. The second theory is far darker. This version suggests the argument on the boat escalated into something physical, and that Natalie's death was not accidental at all. Supporters of this theory point to the bruising found on her body, bruising that the original 1981 investigation largely dismissed, but which later review considered more seriously. They also point to the mismatched timeline between when she went missing and when help was actually called. This is a theory that has fueled endless documentaries, tabloid headlines, and true crime specials over the decades. It's the version that turns a tragic accident into a possible cover-up. The third theory sits somewhere in between. It suggests that what happened was still an accident, but that panic, fear, or simple denial afterward led confusion, delayed reactions, and inconsistent stories, not because anyone was hiding a crime, but because nobody on that boat wanted to fully process what just happened. Here's the uncomfortable truth about all 3 theories. Each one can be supported by pieces of the evidence, and each one can be challenged by other pieces. The bruising could be explained by her body being in the water and near the boat's hull. The delayed timeline could be explained by confusion and intoxication rather than intent to hide something. The dinghy story fits perfectly with an accident, but it also fits with someone trying to make an accident look convincing. Forensic experts who have reviewed the case over the years have disagreed with each other. Some say the physical evidence supports an accidental drowning. Others say certain details simply don't add up cleanly with that explanation. And so, after everything, the case remains exactly where it was left in 2012. Undetermined factors, not solved, not closed, just quietly unresolved, sitting in the space between accident and something else entirely. Which brings us to the final piece of the story. Not what happened that night, because nobody outside that boat can say for certain, but what this case has come to mean and why it still matters more than 40 years later. After everything, here's the truth nobody wants to hear. There may never be a final answer to what happened to Natalie Wood. Not because nobody has tried. Investigators reopen the case. Reporters spend decades chasing new leads. Family members push for answers. Even the people who were actually there, Walken, Wagner, and Davern, eventually gave their accounts, in their own ways, at their own pace. And still, the picture stays incomplete. Maybe that's because some nights only exist fully in the minds of the people who live through them. Everyone else is left working with fragments. A police statement written the morning after. A memoir published decades later. A captain's confession that came only when guilt finally became too heavy to carry alone. None of these accounts are lies exactly. They're just incomplete pieces of something too dark and too private for anyone outside that boat to ever fully understand. What we do know is that a woman with a lifelong fear of dark water ended up in it, alone, in the middle of the night, with no one able to say for certain how she got there. That fact alone carries its own quiet tragedy, regardless of which theory turns out to be true. Christopher Walken's role in this story was never that of a man with dramatic secrets to reveal. His statement, given close to the actual night, remains steady precisely because it doesn't try to explain more than he actually witnessed. He went to bed believing everything was fine. He woke up to a nightmare he never saw coming. That is perhaps the most honest thing anyone connected to this case has ever said. Robert Wagner has spent the rest of his life carrying the weight of public suspicion, whether deserved or not. Dennis Davern has spent his years wrestling with guilt heavy enough to finally break his silence, decades after it might have mattered most. And Natalie Wood, the woman at the center of it all, never got the chance to tell her own side of that night. Maybe this case isn't really about solving a 40-year-old mystery. Maybe it's about understanding how easily the truth can slip away, even when there were witnesses, even when there was an investigation, even when people eventually did talk. Some stories don't end with answers. They end with questions that outlive everyone involved. And Natalie Wood's story, more than most, seems destined to remain exactly that. A question the world keeps asking, long after the people who might know the answer are gone. Do you think Natalie Wood's death was truly an accident? Or do you believe there's still a piece of that night the world has never been told? Let me know in the comments below.